our first faculty forum of the semester. Happy January. Our speaker today is Brian Starr. Later in the semester, David Boyer and Amanda Boston will be speaking. And so we're looking forward to 3 really good forums. And Kenneth Hawley has some Equip LCU luncheons planned where people are talking about teaching as vocation that will be good also. So if you play your cards right, you can get a free meal almost every week this semester, which is always good. So I've known Brian for as many years as he's been at LCU, and I always think back to Ron Reed, who told me one time that Monty Python was his favorite movie of all time, and I almost fell out of my shoes. And upon getting to know Ron Reed, I knew that the humor was appropriate, and I should not have been as surprised as I was. And then I get to know Brian Starr, who's an economist and an executive vice president, and really good with numbers and everything. And he tells me he's a Coen Brothers fan. And suddenly, everything I know about Brian shifts. But you've heard him speak. You know he's a good speaker, and he always has a good story to tell. So I'm looking forward to hearing his academic path to LCU and why he stayed here. So we're glad he's here. So Brian, it's all yours.
All right. I'm really delighted and honored to do this. And Susan, I'm sorry you're struggling with the cold today. I'm so impressed that you made it up nonetheless. Now, I promise no tears today. I'm really honored to be a part of this, and I think these faculty forums are wonderful. I've really enjoyed getting to hear everyone's story and the relationships we get to build during this time together. I was born in Austin and spent 2 weeks there, very, very formative 2 weeks of my life. Spent there in Austin, and then my family moved to Kingsville, deep in South Texas, and I don't remember anything of that because when we were 2, I moved to Lytle, Texas, tiny town in South Texas. Has a Dairy Queen now, so bona fide Texas town, very small. We played 2A in sports. Deep in South Texas, I grew up in largely a Hispanic community, and so I was privileged to get to know another group of people than I might have otherwise known if we had stayed in Austin. And when I was growing up, I was there between the ages of 2 and 16 in Lytle. And so my activities in youth, my sister and I were the youth group at our church until my younger brothers were born, and then there were 4 of us in the youth group in the Lytle Church of Christ. I played basketball in junior high, tennis in high school. I wouldn't make what you would call a meaningful contribution to Lytle Pirate athletics, but I did attempt to play. I was a little bit better at academic events. And there I could make a little bit more contribution, and I got to do things like UIL public speaking. And I was in FFA, and back in the 70s and early 80s in South Texas, we really only had 2 sort of vocational classes, and it was gender specific. FFA for the men and some of the girls, and FHA for the ladies, and some of the guys who endured sore abuse for their choice of being in future homemakers of America. And I showed sheep, and it was for my animal of choice. And this is a South Down sheep. They're intolerably cute animals. And actually, my freshman year in high school, I had the reserve grand champion South Down sheep at the San Antonio Livestock Show and Rodeo. His name was Knee-High, very appropriately named South Down. Very cute, cuddly animals, and I had one good one that whole time. And so it was a good time growing up, very rural community, small community, very formative. And then we moved to Abilene when I was at the beginning of my junior year of high school. And this was a tough transition for me. I'd really, in my sentient years, only known one hometown and one church family and one school. And being taken out of that setting into an entirely new setting in West Texas was a difficult experience. Still had sheep, and they all died. It was the winter of 1983. It was cold. They all caught pneumonia. They died, and one by one I had to dig those little graves and put those little dudes in there. Moved away from my friends. Found out the importance of church being open because youth groups are not as wide open as you stereotype them to be. You know, that group at Southern Hills Church of Christ in Abilene had been together since they were small pups, and this new guy coming in the junior year wasn't exactly a welcome addition to this tight-knit group. And so it was a traumatic experience for me in some ways. It was a challenging time, but of course, new friends, new opportunities that I made. It took a little while, but that happened over time. I graduated from Wiley High School, which is sort of Abilene's equivalent of, say, Cooper, Southside School District, somewhat suburban. And I was introduced there. I was thankful that I had some teachers of the caliber that I had not had at Lytle High School in South Texas. Viewed itself as a college preparatory school, and I had some really good teachers who caught me up to speed on some concepts that I needed to catch up on, specifically mathematics and science. That had not been exposed to in a very rigorous way growing up in the South Texas community. And I matriculated to Abilene Christian. I was an ag business major. And I was, one of the reasons that I got to go to college was I had a Houston Livestock Show and Rodeo Scholarship for $5,000 a year. And at that time, that was a lot of money, a substantial portion of the tuition. And stacked with other scholarships, I was very blessed to be able to afford the private school tuition there. Now, I didn't know much about LCU. I had only been on campus once. Our youth group would come to Encounter from Southern Hills rather than going to Kadesh there. LCU was known as the place that did sort of the best summer camps, so we would come up here. But I came up here, and I think I heard Steve Joyner speak maybe, or I heard someone speak, and I'm sure I ran into John King. That was a good experience, but other than that, I had no exposure to Lubbock Christian. And at ACU, unlike our student body, my academic path was also marked with also having to work. Now, while this is very ubiquitous here and among our student body at LCU, it is very uncommon at Abilene Christian. At that time, and certainly today, I believe, for students to work. I had to work at the lumber yard. I worked at a place called Payless Cashways. And I worked for a gentleman that I went to church with. He was the manager there, and he was so kind as to give me a job. But that inspired a great interest in academics. Because I decided, I don't want to haul concrete the rest of my life, right? And load lumber. And frankly, this was, at the time, I was a little bit envious because most of my friends would say, hey, we're going to Dallas this weekend, Brian. Bring $500. We'll stay in the Galleria area. We'll eat at West End, and we'll have a good time. And I'm thinking, I can't go. I've got to work at the lumber yard so I can pay for things like luxuries, like rent. And $500 would be a month's worth of income for me at the lumberyard in the early 1980s. So I felt a bit of a distance, if you will, from the rest of my cohort at Abilene Christian. I didn't have time to join a social club or anything like that. I had to work while I was going to school. But that was important because now when I came to teach at LCU, I realized so many of the students are in that boat that I was in when I was going to school that I think it helps me identify with them a little bit better. It also made me appreciate the value of work and hard work, and I really think that it was one of the reasons that I had that resume experience that I actually got accepted into UT's MBA program. It was a top 20 program at the time, and they admitted very, very few students then, and none now, who didn't have 3 to 5 years post-graduation experience. But they let me in, and I think it might have been in part because I had worked at the lumberyard and moved up progressively at the lumberyard during my stay, so I was very, very thankful in retrospect for that experience. So I went through the MBA program, it's a 2-year program, and God took care of me throughout that whole time. One Sunday night, right before I went down, a guy named Rob Jones called my house, and I was out with youth group following church activity, and my mom answered, and he was looking for a roommate, and she said, "I'm sorry, he's at church." And Rob said, "Really?" And it turns out he was Baptist, which I viewed fairly spuriously. But I'm telling you, God put that man in my life to be a Christian influence on me. So I was his roommate, and it was a good, godly man who took his faith walk very seriously, challenged me to memorize Scripture, challenged me to be a witness to the UT community. So I was thankful that God put me with a believer there and a roommate because there were very few believers in the MBA program. Contrary to your stereotype of UT Austin, it's not the hotbed of conservative spirituality that you might think that it would be. And as a result, your faith is constantly bombarded there. I mean, constantly questioned, constantly challenged. So having a good Christian roommate, I met Christy my very first day at church, at University Avenue Church of Christ, which I'm so thankful somebody planted right there on the UT campus. It literally, I could throw a rock from where we met and hit the education building on the UT campus. And so I was so thankful I met her the first day we started dating. We got married right after I graduated, and she was still in college. At UT, I was a teaching and research assistant. I decided I need a job, and why not be a TA? Well, why not do that? So I worked for Professor Susan White in the finance department, and she allowed me to hold her office hours for her and meet her students, and she allowed me to assist her with her research and go into the library stacks and dig out old tax court cases regarding how courts had ruled on dividend policy. It was my first exposure to this idea that an academic career might at some point be in the offings. So very formative 2 years of my life there in grad school. That was part one. I did not know, but there would be more to come. So the first job, I was a retirement plan consultant, which is every man's dream, to be a retirement plan consultant, right? And I was hired right out of the MBA program, and I worked there in Austin because Christy was still going to school. She had started out at Southwestern University in Georgetown, a private school, very small, wonderful school, but matriculated to UT to graduate to get some upper division courses she could not at Southwestern. And so as a retirement plan consultant, I did this for 5 years right out of the MBA program. These were some of my clients that I got to work with. So I got to work with Dell Computer. My boss had sat down with Michael and said, hey, you've got this growing business. You ought to start a 401k plan. And they did. And the business was blessed and it grew. A lot of my fellow consultants bought stock in Dell Computer right when it went IPO. And they said, aren't you going to buy stock? No, I'm a passive investor, right? Stupidest decision I've ever made in my life. I worked with Frost Bank. They're a San Antonio-based firm, and we did their behind-the-scenes 401k plan work for them. And then I got set up the plan for a little grocery store that started up in there. John Mackey and his leadership team, which was, man, this was the most unusual leadership team you can imagine. So if you imagine Austin and distilled into the very quintessence of Austin, that is who runs Whole Foods, all right? They think Austin is just, they would think Boston or Berkeley would be very conservative places to be, and certainly Austin would be. I mean, this is a very unusual group, so you can imagine how that went. I just shut up about most things and just stuck to business with this group. But I got to work with some very interesting groups, all the way from computer manufacturers to one of the big regional banks of South and Central Texas, and Whole Foods, which has done quite well, and I got to go across the country helping their employees save for retirement. But then 5 years into that, I continued, and Christy had continued to work with our campus ministry. Opening came up for the campus minister position. Scott Sager took off to be the pulpit minister at the Preston Road Church of Christ. And I was privileged to step into that position, and I was campus minister there for 4 years at the University Avenue Church of Christ. And I worked with UT students, typically who came from our tradition, though there weren't very many denominational loyalties down there. So I worked with Baptist and Methodist and Catholics and people who had no faith affiliation at all, but just looked for a group of friends, and we tried to share Jesus with them. And it was a very potent experience for me. It was a wonderful experience, and I'm so blessed that I got to do that. And while I was there, this grad school part 2, I decided, I've got an MBA. That doesn't exactly equip you for ministry. So I pursued a Master of Arts in Religion. And my degree says Abilene Christian, but I took most of my courses there in Austin from what is now the Austin Grad School of Theology. And it was then Institute for Christian Studies and ACU accredited their degrees for them in a joint effort. So I had some ACU professors, some Oklahoma Christian professors, but mostly my professors were there from ICS. So I did that for 4 years and might have stayed in ministry the rest of my life, but we had a growing family. And one night when I got in at 10 o'clock, as was my wont, and Christy is bathing our middle son, she looked at me and said, I'm not going to raise these kids alone anymore. You're going to come home. You're going to go back to your day job, and you're going to be a daddy, and you're going to be a husband. And what do you say to that? Yes, ma'am. That was. I could not deny that. I felt a responsibility, a call. I had, to my discredit, not done a great job of balancing work and life, and that's difficult when you're in ministry because some of you know this. Every minute that you're spending, you feel like your work is really important with that person. Literally, a person saying, "I'm about to kill myself. Why shouldn't I?" And it's hard to tell that person, "Hey, I've got to go bathe the kid right now." Right? So I went back at that point. Christy and I have 3 kids. They're Josh and Caleb on a recent outing to Palagero Canyon. There's Rachel. We call her Bunny. So there she is, holding a bunny. So with a growing family, I went back to the day job. By this time, the firm had been bought out. It had been called Plan Data, just a local firm. Now we were called InvestSmart, which I thought was a terrible name. And we had hired a consulting firm to come up with a marketing slogan for us. And they came up with Invest Smart, Retire Right. It turns out they were also Continental Airlines marketing consultant who had come with Work Hard, Fly Right. And they charged us an untold amount to simply rebrand that into Invest Smart, Retire Right. We had overlords there before we went IPO. One was SoftBank and some other venture capitalists. The funny thing about these guys is they invest in a business, and for some reason, they want their money back. And so they were not easy taskmasters, and they were constantly. Pretty soon, I was the manager of that office there in Austin, and they were driving very, very hard for what I considered to be window dressing, short-term profitability, so that they could sell us to another buyer, which they did. They sold us eventually to the Standard. But after I'd been doing that for 4 years, I had grown tired of working for venture capitalists, and I felt something missing in life. I missed working with college students in particular. And so I wondered, is there a way that I could not be in ministry so I can pay attention to my family and their very legitimate needs that God has called me to, but also work with college students in some capacity. I saw in the Christian Chronicle this advertisement for a business position open at Lubbock Christian University. And we came up here in June of 2003. God provided a perfect day. It was 70 degrees. And so the weather was beautiful, and Russell Dabb said it's that way here every day in June. And I met Tracy Mack, and I met some other folks, and Christy said, "What in the world are we doing?" Right? I'm from Austin. She'd grown up in Austin. But she said, "The weather here is beautiful, all right? And if you really want to do this, then you can pursue this." So I came up to Lubbock Christian, and we moved up here in the very end of December of 2003, and I began teaching spring 2004. And I came up the first day and I ran track in the field house, and I thought, man, this high altitude, I'm running like twice as fast as I can normally run. Then realized it's an 8-mile track, and I enrolled then in the PhD program in economics at Texas Tech University, and so I was teaching typically 9 or 12 hours in any given semester, and I was taking 6. And here's a picture of Professor Thomas Steinmeier, who allowed me into the program, and a picture of Professor Klaus Becker, a German mathematician who was my microeconomic theory teacher, and among some other classes. And that was a wonderful time of life. I have to admit, I just love teaching. It's a favorite part of my job. And so getting to teach every day and then getting to go to class was just a really, really energizing time of life. I loved it. And so it took about 4 years, to get through all the classes and then the comprehensive exams. And then the time became stressful because 2/3 of my cohort failed their comprehensive exams in the econ program. Every PhD program has, as Andy has shared with us, and we'll have to slaughter a pig to get rid of the image of what he had to go through. to defend his dissertation. In my program, it wasn't the dissertation, it was the comprehensive exams that they used as sort of the weed out tool. And of course, this comes at the end of all of your coursework and before you do your dissertation. I was railing against the lack of ethics and admitting people that they had no chance of passing, apparently. But that was just how it was. They took it a little bit earlier than I did because I was going part-time, they were going full-time, and so there was much study and much prayer in preparation for the comprehensive exams. And some of you had to endure me while I was there. Perry came one time and said, "I absolve thee, go play golf." And he and Dr. Peebles would periodically take me to play a round of golf when I was on the verge of insanity from studying for those comprehensive exams. But the Lord got me through, and I'm thankful to this family for helping me get through that time. Getting a PhD, of course, is supposed to be a challenge. It was, but I'm grateful for all the people who supported me. Then I went into the dissertation phase, and so I got to, then the ball, at least in this program, is more in your court because you get to do something that's of interest to you. The comps are about what's interesting to your professors, then the dissertation's about what is interesting to you. So I did 3 different essays, and the first was really asking, do children learn retirement savings behavior from their parents? That was the most interesting to my professors. I couldn't find a lot of academic evidence of that. I am not even covering it here. I simply use University of Michigan's panel study of income dynamics for the data set. Really, I think it's premature to answer this question. There have been studies, other studies done in the field on savings in general, but not specific to retirement savings. Really wasn't able to prove that the evidence would support that conjecture. Second essay was analysis of historic fee structures in 403B plans, and I had come from the retirement plan industry, so this was of interest to me. And then I was wondering, what impact would recent retirement plan legislation have on the welfare of these 403B plan participants as effectively providers or employers were forced to consolidate providers. So just a brief bit of history here. 401k plans and 403b plans are very, very similar in many ways. They're both retirement savings vehicles. 401k plans traditionally for the for-profit sector. 403b plans traditionally for the state and the not-for-profit sector. And the rules governing them had run parallel but never quite in sync. And the Pension Protection Act came along and tried to force them to play by effectively the same rules. And my question was, will this be helpful or harmful? Because what was effectively forcing us to do, and Tracy and I sat on the committee that decided that following other employers, we were going to consolidate providers. And some of you got really upset about that because you'd been with the same provider for a long time. And so, I was interested in, well, what effect will this have? People perceive it'll be a very detrimental impact. Will it be or will it not be? And so did some research. Now, please, on this next slide, refrain from breaking out into ecstatic dancing or anything like that. People sometimes get overly excited when they see the results here. I mean, it's just such an exhilarating topic, right? But this is the mathematical theory behind why maybe this would be a good idea to consolidate providers. And what this is really, just read the highlight, never mind, I'll tell you what the highlighted part basically means. 403B plans were dispersed in the providers. So you came to an employer and they said, well, you just go pick whoever you want. But these providers would then have to go out and individually market to each person, all right? And they typically charge very high fees. And my question was, why are people willing to pay these very high fees for 403B plans in comparison to just, an after-tax brokerage account or something like this? And the answer mathematically lies in the fact that there are these nice tax breaks, right? And the tax breaks that are afforded by Section 403B of the Internal Revenue Code create what in economics we would call this consumer surplus, this extra well-being for you if you buy that particular product versus having to pay tax on some bank account or brokerage account. All right, so, mathematically, that was the only thing we could tease out that would indicate a willingness to pay these extremely high fees. So when I looked at what people should be willing to pay and use some averaging assumptions of people's federal income tax brackets nationwide, state income tax brackets nationwide, life expectancies, earnings power right now, expected returns on their investments, and baked all that into the equation that I could. Kind of found out that based on the current tax code, the average person should be willing to pay this 2.6% premium roughly to get the tax break afforded by Section 403B of the Internal Revenue Code. Does that make sense to everyone? So the theoretical question of why are people paying higher fees is, well, they're paying it to get the tax break. And that's the only reason that you can prove mathematically in an unambiguous way. All right? Now here's what else I found. I hope you can see that. Maybe you can, maybe you can't. I actually looked at some different 403B service providers and asked, well, what are they actually charging? All right? Now check this out. The first two, Provider 1 and Provider 2, are charging about 0.76%, 0.625%. All right? These, by the way, are mutual funds. One of them's Fidelity, and they just have a sort of a low fee structure. Look at the others. Provider 3 is charging 3.25%. And Provider 4 is 2%. Provider 5 is 2%. Do those numbers look interesting? The reason it's interesting, it's very close to, on average, what a person would be willing to pay because of the tax break. But then, let me ask you the question, if you followed me. If you selected Provider 3, 4, or 5, who's getting the benefit of the tax break? The provider. And what are you capturing as the participant that's left over after they take their share? That would be zero. Does that make sense? And so the little aha moment here is they had apparently done their work, these providers, and realized that a rational person would be willing to pay up to this amount. But by paying that amount, they forewent all the advantage they had afforded to them by the government. In other words, what the government had intended as a surplus for retirement savers was actually being captured by 403B service providers. So, then the third essay is, all right, as we consolidate and get fees down, will that be beneficial or not? And the answer, as you can imagine, is yes, it is beneficial. And so I know some of you hated us for consolidating to a single provider, but for the vast majority of people at LCU, and I'm conjecturing this happens across the nation, the fee savings can be quite substantial. Now you actually get some of the benefit of the tax break rather than having all of that captured by the producer, and you get some consumer surplus. So in the big picture, in some not likely insignificant number of individually marketed 403B plans, the historic fees charge captured basically all of the benefit that was created by this tax break. So that was the finding there on part 2. Then on part 3, this consolidation that was forced in getting 403B plans to basically, in effect, adopt a single provider approach, kind of like 401k plans had always done. There's some obvious disadvantages here that I'm not mentioning, and those are the ones that people would bring to our attention. But I love my service provider, right? They know me by name. I'm not just a number. And all of these things are given up, and you give up that competition of, if I don't like so-and-so, I can go choose so-and-so. But the price you paid for that was fairly large. And the answer I was trying to search for was, well, how large is it? And compounded over time, what difference does that make in the eventual outcome you have as a retirement plan participant? And, I ran a bunch of different Monte Carlo scenarios here to try to model this, but and it really depended on whether you're working for a small employer who pays typically higher fees, mid-sized employer, or a large employer. But in any way, I ran it for 100,000 people in each different iteration that I would run, and usually it's split between 60 to 65% of the people coming out on top versus 30 to 35% coming out as losers. Who are the losers? Well, they were people who would have adopted the plans earlier of a provider 1 or 2. In other words, certain people went straight to a Fidelity or a Vanguard that aren't actively marketing their products but had enough knowledge of the industry to go and select a low-fee provider. They're the losers. But the majority of the plans seem to be actively marketed where either excess profit or high marketing cost of individually marketing these were necessitating these extremely high fees that was soaking up all the benefit of the tax break. So about 60 to 65% seem to fall in that category. And when you look at the average difference of account balances at the end, you're probably talking $20,000 to $30,000 that's more in your pocket on average as a result of going to a consolidated provider, with the maximum differences being in order of $500,000 or more for some individuals. And some people, clearly there are losers. Anytime you have winners, typically there's an unintended consequence of winning. There can be some losers. The differences there are typically of a smaller magnitude. Typically, the losses of the losers are much smaller than the gains of the winners, and on average, people seem to come out ahead by $20,000 to $30,000 in terms of their ending balances. Now, while doing this, I had switched over here, and I took on some responsibilities on the administrative side. So I had dreams of publishing each one of these. And you know how when you're writing your dissertation, here are 10 more topics that are on the research agenda as soon as I get finished with this one, right? And that list is gathering dust. But I was able, I was blessed to complete the dissertation, defend it, even while I had taken on some administrative duties in addition to continuing to be able to teach. I was able to publish one of those in Financial Services Review. It was that middle article, which from an economic standpoint might not be as interesting as the first one, but I found to be fairly interesting because of my background. So that's my road to academia. It's a fairly mixed road. I'm a bit of an academic mutt, having studied ag business as an undergrad and then done an MBA and then done a Master of Arts in Religion and finally a PhD in economics. That's not a standard path perhaps to the academy, but I was very blessed by each of these experiences that I had academically. Tremendously blessed. I joined LCU because it gave me the opportunity to put my vocation and my faith together once more, a yearning that I had had ever since I left ministry. I'm so deeply grateful to this place and to my colleagues who allow me to work in an environment that shares that, what I consider to be very lofty goal of putting our faith together with what we do in practice. What a blessing that we get to do that every day, and I'm so blessed to work with each one of you. So thanks for letting me share a little bit of my story with you today, and I'll be happy to answer questions now, especially if you have questions regarding your retirement account or something like that.
Well, I'll begin with two questions. Is there actually something called the implicit function theorem?
Yes.
It is.
Yes.
And can you explain that in like 2 sentences?
No. Don't think you can.
Not in 2 sentences. That's a little. Just a the equations that we had were not easily solved. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And given that, we simply use the implicit function theorem to kind of join a couple of questions and then do what we could call comparative static analysis, saying, how does this variable affect the function itself? So we can't necessarily solve directly for the function. That's why I had to use the computer to estimate these, 2.5%. But, economists and those who are evaluating dissertations don't necessarily want you to just use the computer. They want to see the economic theory behind it. So that was expressing it a little bit more formally for purposes of the committee, showing that under this set of mathematical assumptions, this outcome should obtain. And then the next step typically in economics is let's go test that against some empirical data. So that's all that was doing. That was the theory intellectually stated or analytically stated, or they would say formally stated and rigorously stated. And then the actual real world data followed. Is that fair enough, Dr. Peters?
I think so. Let's see. Keith Rogers here. You use some sort of numerical technique to approximate those integrals and get whatever decimal. Whatever answers you get.
Sure.
Approximately.
So we use mathematical techniques in economics, and so it's good to have mathematicians help inform us along the way of what we can do and what we cannot.
That's good.
The vast majority of problems like that don't have an exact solution. So
Right.
you get an approximate solution is what you get, which is it's still very good, even though it's not an exact solution. But the exact solution is hard to come by in a lot of math problems.
And I couldn't come up with it in that one. And if you can, I salute you. Right? That's
My
amazing.
second question is, Christy asked you to balance work and life, and you really love teaching. So I'm wondering if you feel like, I mean, I've always worried about you not teaching as much as you would like to and getting into administration. But do you feel like you've achieved that balance?
Most days I do. You know, I get to teach every week. So I teach a course in the fall. I usually teach microeconomics, and then in the spring I'll bounce back and forth. This spring I'm teaching investments. I get to teach every Sunday morning at church, and so I feel like I get opportunities. Obviously, I'm teaching very different things there. One's using one form of academic training. One's using another form of academic training. But I actually enjoy that. Neither side of my brain is particularly good, so I have to exercise both to have a ghost of a chance of achieving some balance here. So I get to do that, and it really is a blessing to me. There are some days, clearly, I'd like to teach more, but there are also days when I feel like that was just wonderful, and that will be sufficient.
Someone else?
Question. The question that I expected you to tell us that you talked about, when did you get into deep sea fishing?
You know, that was when I was in Austin. I had a good friend, James Thomas, who's just as opposite from me as you can possibly imagine. I'm small and white, and he is a large African-American man. I'm conservative, he's liberal, but we're both Christians. And so we would hang out together, you know, partly for torture of, you know, comparing political ideas, but partly just because we helped each other grow. And James said one day, you know, we ought to go deep sea fishing. And I said, yeah, we should. And so we did. And we got into it, and I went with my friend James and some other friends from church. And it's a habit I picked up when I was in Austin. I haven't been able to shake it. And it's a terrible habit to have if you live in Lubbock, Texas. I need to take up goose hunting or something here in Lubbock, Texas, but haven't been able to shake that habit. We were only 4 hours from Port A when we were in Austin, so we could get up at midnight, be at the boat, and all was well. It's a little bit longer drive here.
Someone else?
Well, having known your folks at Harding, and I was in class with his mother-in-law before Brian was born. And your dad has been a barber ever since he left Harding, is that right?
On and off, yes.
On and off. But the fact that he had taught at Harding had never brought any impact upon you, or was that ever? He ever talked about his work at Harding, and I'm sure he enjoyed his work in the Christian environment.
Absolutely.
That had not impacted your life at all.
I did. I think he's always been a teacher at heart, and I think I always have been too. And so I think that I was sort of born into that genetic profile. I think I was born into that environmentally, and that clearly had an impact on my being here today. Andy?
When you were considering where you were going to attend your undergraduate training, was LCU on your list?
No, I didn't. I had always sort of, well, since we moved to Abilene, I thought, well, it's right here in town, and it's a Christian school, so why not there, right? At that point in my life, I wasn't quite ready to venture forth, so I didn't even apply to any other school. I just applied to ACU and went. Now, when it came time for graduate work, by that point, I was exploring other options. So I looked at Pepperdine and some other alternatives as well, but ended up, again, staying somewhat close to home and going to UT Austin. I'm not sure that's altogether different than a lot of people who are 17 and considering. They probably have, well, I'm familiar with that place, and I could go there. So that was certainly the case with me. Plus, I had multiple friends from church who were going to head there. Great question.
I'm curious about the people who failed at their comprehensive exams. do they have remediation of any sort, or are they just gone?
You know, the economics department is not as coddling as you would think it would be. And so it's,
Take on math department,
I'm sure that's true. That was just, Dr. Becker did not suffer fools lightly. I mean, he once threatened to throw the chalk at me in class. And it was, so once you had a second chance to pass before they formally kicked you out of the program and dismissed you from the program. Many did not avail themselves of the second chance. They just assumed that I couldn't pass this time. Often they would just simply settle for the lesser requirements of a master's degree, and some just would go out into the workforce or transfer to another place to pursue their academic education. I didn't know if that was common or not. I don't know if, 2/3 of your cohort that you started with maybe didn't make it through either. I was rather shocked that the failure rate was so substantial. But maybe that's very common at state schools and in PhD programs. Maybe that, 1 out of 3 does make it, the others just don't. So it shocked me, but maybe it should not have.
At TCU, we had several who failed, but not to that extent, I'm thinking. Although I'm not good at math, so I don't know.
Well, rest assured, that metric inspired me to love and good works, and to much prayer. So it was, you take that and you look at it, and it's very daunting to see that sort of number of people that you consider to be very good minds and hard workers failing, and it is very intimidating. But you simply pray, ask people to pray for you, and then redouble your efforts on studying and trust that the Lord will get you through. And He did. He was faithful.
Anyone else? Well, thank you, Brian. We appreciate it.
Thank you.